Okay, hello. So let's talk about optimizing shareability and context awareness of state. So I created this little visual here, which has two axes, one of shareability and one of context awareness. And I put it like this because these two things affect each other. And so if you think about local state has a high degree of context awareness. What that basically means is that if you implement state in a specific component and you also implement the UI in that specific component, they are literally in the same context. So your state is as context aware about the UI as the UI is of the state. But it's not very shareable, like you define it within one component. And that's what we need. We need to share state and the management of that state. So to go on the completely other side, you can implement this as a global state. And that has like the peak shareability and can be accessed by any component. But it also has a low degree of context awareness. So a global state store doesn't know anything about what components are currently active in your application. So there's a decoupling there. And the way you kind of see this leak into your code is that maybe you have defined what the current page is in your global state store, but any components within a certain page consuming the state of your global state store really needs to verify for the global state store that we are indeed on this page now, or at least needs to check to get the correct typing, for example. And sometimes we overlook this as developers, but it says something about you as a developer. You always have a high degree of context awareness, but your code doesn't necessarily have that. So a way to mediate this is to use scoped state. And this is where you create state around a certain concept in your app, for example, a page. So the state will know that all the components within this that has access to this state, they are also in a page context, a specific page context. And they don't have to verify anything. So you kind of create maximum context awareness and maximum shareability. That's kind of what we're targeting here. So let's see what this looks like in code. So here we have a project DTO with an ID and title. We have a project state because we need to fetch our project. And we have a single component representing a project that has the state implementation where we might have project state or we might not have it. So what we do is we're using an effect, and if we don't have a project, we go ahead, we fetch the project, and we set the correct project state. That allows us to check if we don't have a project or if it's pending, we can return a loading state. If it has a rejected status, we can show the error, or we can show the title of the project and change its title. So this is local state. It's a beautiful thing when you can do this. But what if we want to start sharing this state? So we have the same setup here, but now instead of inserting the title directly in the project component, we want to separate that into a child component called title. And to share this state with that component, we have to pass it down as a prop. And we also have to pass down the ability to change that title as a prop. And as we can see, we have our title component, we show the title, and we can change that title. And this is fine. Like passing to a child component is fine. And it's really what React was built for. But this concept makes a lot more sense if, for example, we had a button component from a library and there's like a variant prop on it, for example. That kind of props passing to like UI components, that makes a lot of sense. But when we're passing state and state management down to components, it gets a little bit trickier. And the reason is that this title component will probably be defined in a different file. So if a developer came in and wanted to do something with this title, and they see, okay, where's this title coming from? Ah, it's coming as a prop. Okay, let's figure out where is this title coming from. And then we're jumping into a different file. And then it's like, okay, I'm passing it from the data. And where's the data? Okay, it's coming from here. So my point is that we've created a level of indirection, which makes it harder for the other developers to figure out where the state and the management of that state actually comes from. But it can get a little bit worse, because now we only passed state and state management to an immediate child. If we go down here, it's the same implementation, but now we have a top bar. And that top bar has other components and other UI, but it also holds the title. So now we need to pass the title and the management of that title to the top bar. And then the top bar just passes that information down to our title component. So again, a developer is going to the title. They need to see, okay, we have title. Let me go and find the reference of that title. Okay, now we're in the top bar file. Okay, where's the title coming from? Oh, it's coming from a prop. Let's figure out what's using the top bar. Okay, here's the top bar. Okay, it's coming from this data. So this is what happens. This is what we call props drilling. And we add all these levels of indirection, and it becomes very, very difficult, especially for new developers, to figure out what is going on here. But it can get even worse. Because what if we had a sibling component that needed access to this project? It isn't just the project page. We have an actual main menu, which is unrelated to a specific page. But when you're on a project and you loaded the project, we want to show the title of the project in the main menu, for example. So again, we have the same logic, but now we have moved it to an app component. And the reason is that the app component also covers the main menu. But as I said, the main menu also wants access to the projects. We need to move that logic up to the app, even though the app isn't really concerned about loading up the project. So here we can see we pass the title to the main menu, and now we pass the title and the ability to change that title down to the project, which again uses the top bar, which again uses the title. So this creates a lot of friction, managing state and managing the state this way. So what we tend to do is that we go global. And I'm not defining this. This is more like pseudocode. So I'm not taking into account reactivity and stuff like that. But again, we have our project ETO, we have our project state, and we have our global store. But this global store doesn't know if we have a project. Right? It's not scoped to a specific project page. It's just global, and we don't know if we have the project, but we can fetch a project and we can set the title of a project. Those state management implementations are also global. And then we have our global store, which does the fetching of the project as we might expect. But as you can see in the set title, since that is defined globally, and we don't know if we actually, like you as a developer, you know that you will only change the title when you've actually loaded the project, but the code doesn't know that. So we need to not only check that we have a project, but we also need to check if that project is actually loaded before we can change the title of it. Now you would probably expose this with a hook, and looking at the code, it's much cleaner, right? We still have our app where we do the initial fetching of the project, but we don't have to pass anything down. We can use the store within the main menu, but still we don't know within the main menu if we have a project and if that project is actually loaded. So we need to check that. And then we have our project, we have our top bar, and you have to imagine there's tons of other components here as well. But again, in the title, we're using the store. We don't know if we have a project or if it's been loaded. So what we can do to alleviate this is that we can use scope store. Excuse me. So here we create a project context and a project provider. And this project provider takes data, and the data is the actual loaded project. So the intention of this scoped state is that it exposes a loaded project and the ability to change the title. So here we initialize the project provider with the actual loaded project. We create the ability to change the title, and we expose that on a context value in React. And then we create a hook for it called useProject, which will throw an error if you use that hook in an invalid context. Now we can take a look at the code again. We have our app. We do the data fetching for the project. And when we have the project, we mount the project provider, we give it the initial data for the project, and we load our components. And what happens now is that our components are free to use that hook. And they know that whenever this hook is available, we're in the right context and we can just consume the loaded project. So you see that the state just became more context aware of what page you're on and what components are using the state. So let's look at the impact implementation. But before doing that, it's like, why can't you just do it like this? And the providers in React is really great conceptually, but the problems occur in the implementation details. So for example, here I'm just using an object on the context value, which means that whenever the parent component of the project provider reconciles, the project provider reconciles, we create a new object, and all consuming children of this provider will also reconcile. We're also limited on state. So it doesn't matter what state changes on this project. So for example, when we change the title, components, there's only one component in this app that cares about, or two components that cares about this title, but it might be a ton of other state that a lot of other components consumes from the project. But when you change the title, everything will reconcile. Or if you change some other state, both the main menu and the title will also reconcile, even though the title didn't change. So you can't like select specific state from these context providers. So the way you would do this with impact is that, first of all, you would encapsulate the things you want to do. So for example, we will create an API store that's responsible for fetching projects. So in this case, it's just a single project we're fetching. So we're just using a query for that. And then we have a project store that takes the initial project data and creates a signal out of it. Now, what we could do here is that we could split up the project data into multiple signals, optimizing the reconciliation so that the title would be its own signal, for example. So that when the title changes, only components consuming the title will reconcile. And again, we expose the title, we give the ability to change the title, and then we create a stores provider for our project or our project page. So in our app, we would use our API store to go and fetch the project. And we're using the query primitive here, which gives us a project query back that has a status of pending, rejected, or it's resolved. And when it's resolved, we mount the project stores provider where we just have a single store, the project store, and we give it the initial data. And now in our components where we consume our state, we go and we use the project store. And it knows that we have a loaded project and that you can change the title of that project. And here we also implement with the reactivity using observe. So it doesn't matter which store you're consuming reactive state from, it will track any access to that state. And again, we are down here with the title and ability to change the title and and everything's good in the world. Now, so what impact is basically doing is enabling you to not choose between local state and props drilling, which has a lot of friction, and global state, which is high on shareability but creates friction on context awareness, but rather gives you a primitive that allows you to scope your state to specific pages and features to balance shareability and context awareness in your state and the management of that state. Thanks for watching.